Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Granito de Oro extended wash processed Colombia from H&S Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the El Cerro, an extended wash processed Peruvian coffee. And when picking up that coffee for our February 2025 coffee of the month, we decided to add this one alongside it, mostly because this one did sound like an interesting coffee. So we will see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 60. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a significantly lower extraction one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which usually indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we actually went a little bit more coarse on the grind with this one instead. Now, roast profile for this coffee, they also have it listed as one of their ultralight offerings, and given that there's a slight bit more processing on this one, it doesn't quite feel as light as some of the other offerings we've had from them in the past, but largely based off the brightness, you can still tell that this one does skew on the very light side of things, so this one still skews on the very light side by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 31, first impression through the V60, and that's the first takeaway I had from this coffee, was that it didn't feel quite as clean as the previous experiences we have had from H&S in the past. We do have one previous experience with one of their coffees. In fact, one of the very first coffees we ever worked on with them being a little bit more heavy than initially expected, but that was certainly the case with this one, as there were lots of heavier tropical characteristics to it, with a slight bit of graininess leading to a very uneven first impression. So the graininess also another factor of the very light profile in this one. So not necessarily the best first start. Really nothing went right the first time we tried this coffee. Day 34 through the Chemex, and there was a similar sentiment this time around, as it's offering plenty of the heavier fermenting qualities to it in a mostly tropical sense, with a slight bit of graininess and tartness that's hindering the overall experience. So still not necessarily great, as it still wasn't particularly clean. And in hindsight, thinking about it, this one, while it does have the word washed on there, the extended component of that for a Colombian coffee should have probably warned me off of it ever so slightly. But what is kind of interesting is H&S did seem to abandon their funk meter, as the very first time I ever purchased from H&S, they did have a funk meter on their coffees, and this one at minimum would score that level 1 in terms of funk, at least based off of these first couple of impressions. So if it's worth doing, then maybe bringing back the funk meter. But we'll go ahead and move on to day 37, as we opted for the April brewer, and it was the best it had been to this moment, as there's notably less of the fermentiness and graininess, though both are still present. Listed Hawaiian Punch felt notably more apt, as there's better clarity and flavor separation to the entirety of the coffee. In addition to that, it just felt a little bit cleaner, so a better experience this time around, which definitely lent itself towards the sentiment that this coffee was probably going to work better with some lower extraction adjustments, but we said, no, it's an H&S coffee. Let's see what happens if we push this one. So that's what we did. Day 40, there's a V60 with our H&S recipe, so 17:1 at 99 Celsius with a more fine grind, and the coffee was surprisingly better, actually, as the fermenting and graining qualities were a little bit more toned down, and this time around there's a bit more of a distinct darker berry tone to it with the tartness, so that was in line with the listed blackcurrant, and that made a lot more sense to me this time around. Otherwise, there was some artificial sugariness to it, which I imagine is what they're going for with the notes that they have listed on this coffee. We'll go ahead and move on, though, to day 43, as we opted for the Chemex with H&S recipes and H&S's recipe, and there's still mixed impressions of this one, as there's notably more graininess this time around with a strong tropical punch characteristic to it. So that's to say very red, which isn't quite ideal. I really don't like the red qualities of Colombian coffees. In addition, it's had very sweet but also tart with more of that artificial sugar, so this was just okay as of this moment. And on day 46, I decided to go the complete opposite direction with this coffee, and we went lower extraction adjustments. So back to our normal grind, went a little bit more coarse on that, then went lower on the temperatures to 93 Celsius and a 15:1 ratio on it. And it was surprisingly the best that it had been to this moment, as there was significantly less fermentiness to it, even compared to the time that we pushed this coffee. So that lent itself towards two ideas. One, that this coffee seemed to be settling a little bit over time, but the second being that really kind of keeping this coffee at a more toned down level was probably going to help it, as this was actually the best the coffee had been throughout the entirety of the time we were working with this coffee, as there was a much better defined tropical fruit quality to it, with a cleaner, punchy feel to it, just significantly better overall. Day 49, through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and while it's improved in this brew method as well with making these adjustments, there's still traces of that graininess and fermentiness, mostly in a tropical, citric tropicality. And every time I brewed it with the Chemex, there was a lot of graininess to it. Really did not like this coffee through that brew method, but I continuously say when it comes to H&S's coffees, that brew method just doesn't seem to work with it well. Day 52, final notes we do have through the V60 with the day 46 recipe, and the coffee is better overall, but interestingly enough, it wasn't quite as impressive as that day 46 experience. So that's to say that this coffee also had a little bit of inconsistency throughout the time we were working with it, but it's otherwise pretty direct with a strong tropical citric brightness to it, a berry tartness, and a long-lasting tropical finish with just a trace of fermentiness as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick. And that is the finish, level 5. When making this tasting wheel, I originally charted the finish at a level 4, but then as I was starting to continue along with the rest of the tasting wheel, I said to myself, I'm still tasting it, so I can still score other parts of this tasting wheel, and it was like that for a very long time. And after I took that sip, even when I took the first sip in this video, I was still tasting this coffee. It has a very extended, long-lasting finish to it. So level 5 is actually where we opted to put it. Unfortunately, the finish comes in that more tropical fermenty sense, so as a result, it's not something that I particularly enjoy, but even then, level 5 where we opted to put it. Handful of level 4s now. We'll start with the sweetness level 4. It is presented in a very artificial sugar sense, and I don't necessarily enjoy that aspect of this coffee. I think that is it Hawaiian Punch that's listed on here? And it's obviously a very overly sugary drink, and I can see why that note made it onto this coffee, because that's just what this coffee has, is a very strong artificial sugariness to it in a red sense as well, given that it is a Colombian coffee. So not the biggest fan of that. We'll go ahead and move on to the acidity level 4. So much tropical brightness to it, and it probably could have scored even higher. There's that current note listed on here, so I think in paper and in theory, this coffee was always going to be very high scoring in terms of the acidity. If anything, it might even be on the higher side of the level 4. I feel like had we not tried to tone this coffee down, then we could have possibly even justified it being in the level 5. It's very bright in that sense. Berry fruit level 4. I mentioned that there's a very dark berry tone to it, which is also unfortunately presented in a little bit more fermenty of a sense. I can also see a lot of red fruit characteristics to it. So watermelon is the one that a lot of people like to identify when it comes to this very strong red quality, this red note in Colombian coffees. And while it's nowhere near the extent of what you'd expect from either a natural or an anaerobic natural Colombian coffee, it just seems to be an ever-present in any Colombian coffee that isn't truly washed, and even a lot of washed processed coffees have a lot of those really strong red berry notes to them. So that right there at the level 4 mark. Citrus fruit level 4, if I recall correctly, I think one of the other things they have listed on here is a pineapple, and I can certainly see that, but once again, it's also presenting in a very artificial sugary sense. So maybe a little bit more of those, either a pineapple juice drink with some added sugar, or those tinned canned pineapple characteristics to it, because it's, I would say, a little bit riper. You're not getting a lot of the bitterness from the pineapple, you're getting a little bit bitterness from somewhere else, but outside of that, yeah, citrus fruit does belong there at the level 4. Lots of those citric qualities to it. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We will start with the florality level 3. I don't have a good descriptor for that. I just remember making this tasting wheel and thinking to myself, it has a very generic floral quality to it that I suppose comes from just the overall origin on this one. Not entirely sure what to make of the florality, if I'm being completely honest. It's just where we decided to chart it. Let's go ahead and move on. We got the body level 3. Definitely plenty of texture within this coffee, as I think I was fully expecting that going into it. And then the final thing, I'm kind of stalling because I'm looking at this tasting wheel and I'm thinking to myself that maybe the stone fruit actually should have been a little higher, because I can get a little bit more of those fermenty stone fruit qualities to it. So a little bit of that slight mango-like tropicality as well. But yeah, the last thing we're discussing is the cleanliness level 3. And there was potential on that day, 46 mark, where I felt this coffee could have possibly scored level 4 in terms of cleanliness, because the way it presented itself had a lot of the graining qualities and the funky qualities toned significantly down, to the point where I felt like maybe if we gave this coffee a little bit more time and went with these same adjustments, then we could justify scoring it there at the level 4. But when we went back to brew it on day 52, they were all there once again, not to the same extent as they had been on some of the earlier days. But even then, this coffee isn't truly clean to the extent that you would hope for when it comes to a wash processed coffee, and it's not a true wash processed coffee, so that's probably why that's the case. Level 3, mostly hindered by the more fermenting qualities of the fruit characteristics within this one. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. In a very weird way, I'm actually happy that I didn't like this coffee, because I feel like there are times where I come in and I just praise everything that H&S releases, and it comes off as me just really being a massive fan of everything that they do have. But it goes to show that even your favorite coffee roasters can release a coffee from time to time that you don't enjoy. And every single coffee roaster that we've reviewed in the past has had something that we haven't enjoyed. September, Old School Manhattan, Sweet Bloom back in the day. There's always going to be at least one or so coffee from a coffee roaster that you just don't necessarily enjoy. And given that this coffee acted very much like a more processed Colombian coffee, it's not really surprising that I didn't enjoy this one as much as I might have thought going into it. I was really hoping that the notes on this one would present themselves in a much more clean and better defined sense, and when I was able to get them toned down to a much more palatable sense, I still don't necessarily think that they were at the level that I was hoping for or expecting from a coffee like this. And a lot of the feedback that I've heard from this coffee specifically is pretty similar to my own, which when I first mentioned this to somebody else, it was a little bit reassuring to hear that not everybody felt that everything H&S releases is the most amazing thing ever. But even then, obviously still one of my favorite coffee roasters out there. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it still does present a cleaner Colombian profile to it, so don't get that part twisted, because generally when it comes to Colombian coffees that have this level of heaviness and fermentiness to them, they don't score a true level 3, and they don't reach the verge of being at a level 4 in terms of the cleanliness. So that's the first place I want to start, but even then it still has plenty of intensity to go alongside that. A very tropical artificial sugar feel to it with a very long lasting sense to it, all presented with a lot of brightness and a lighter profile. So there's definitely somebody that would enjoy a coffee like this, and that's the direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Granito de Oro extended wash processed Colombia from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.